Rain at midnight. He saw her crouched under the street lamp and did not look away. The street smelled of wet concrete and cheap coffee from the diner 2 blocks over. Her hair was plastered to her face like a dark flag. The bag at her feet looked like it had been in a hurry to leave. Daniel Cruz held his steering wheel for a beat as if it were the only thing steady in his life. He had a daughter asleep at home, a part-time job that paid enough for pizza and the electricity bill most months, and a couch on which he could squeeze one more body for a night. He said out loud what he would never post on a sign a town away: "I have room for one." She looked up, and for a second he thought she might refuse. She did not. He unlocked the door because the simplest actions are the ones that change everything. The choice was small and immediate and dangerous in every way that matters. He could have driven on. He did not. A single night would become the hinge of their lives. This is not a story about money. It is about the quiet courage of giving shelter to someone who needs it and seeing a life shift because of a single decision. Hold your breath for a moment, because what they did for each other would ask for loyalty and truth and would force both of them to face a world that prefers labels to people. The walk home smelled of damp laundry and onions from the late-night taco stand. Rain drummed on the hood of his car like a gentle argument. She did not speak at first. When she did, her voice was low and careful. "My name is Isabella," she said, as if it were a small, fragile thing. Daniel slid a spare blanket into the passenger seat and offered his jacket. "Are you all right?" asked Daniel, trying to sound like the kind of man who has time for the long answers. She tightened her grip on the bag and said, "I am fine," which was both true and not. On the ride, the radio played a song about lost lovers, and she hummed once, a sound that made his daughter Maya seem very far, but also very close in his memory. At the door, Maya ran to meet them, hair in a ponytail and a superhero sticker placed wrong on her forehead. She grabbed Isabella like she had known her forever. Daniel watched, heart catching on an old fear, the one that says, "What if?" He considered what a stranger could cost them and what staying silent would cost the stranger. He offered a towel, a bowl of instant soup, a safe bed for one night. There was a short conversation about rules, about bedtime, about how to hide a stranger from a social worker, and the soft clatter of dishes that make a house sound like a home. Little gestures, stacked like planks, a blanket folded, the light left on for Maya. The bowl left half-finished on the counter made everything feel less precarious and slightly more possible. Mornings at their apartment had the smell of cheap pancake mix and the sound of cartoon laughs leaking through the thin walls. Maya learned to talk around a rhythm of small chores and bigger hopes. Isabella moved through that routine with a quiet efficiency that made Daniel notice how she washed plates with a kind of care that he associated with kitchens that had more than warmed food. They traded jokes about cereal and school and the price of toothpaste. Daniel worked nights at the corner laundry, owned by Mr. Patel, and the machine room hummed like an engine of dignity. He introduced Isabella to Rosa, the neighbor who kept a window box of herbs, and Carla, the baker down the street, who always gave a free muffin to Maya. The house filled with small voices. There were more conversations than an apartment deserved, about Maya's stickers, about which cartoons were the correct villains, about whether socks should be sorted by color and by season. Daniel learned Isabella liked loud music when she drew, and that she liked to make lists and cross things out. Each morning a little trust was exchanged, in cash, in hot coffee, in a glove found when winter came early. They began to rely on the presence of other people the way a map relies on marks. The three of them set up a new kind of family, not by design, but by need and by the slow acceptance that being useful to someone else becomes the way people learn to belong. There is a backstory to Daniel that explains his instincts, but does not excuse how fragile he felt inside of them. He was born to parents who worked 2 jobs and taught him a steady hand on the days he could stand still. His father left when he was 12, and his mother learned that kindness paid in small coins and late apologies. Daniel had studied to be an electrician for 2 semesters until bills demanded immediate incomes. He took night classes, he slept in a shared room when work moved him, and he learned to fix a leaky faucet with a dime and stubbornness. The birth of Maya rearranged everything. He had been 25 and terrified and brilliant in ways only new parents are. The mother of his child had left before school photos, and so Daniel learned schedules and school lunches and how to soothe a fever with vinegar on a rag and whispering nonsense about stars. He kept a photograph in the top drawer of his bedside table of Maya in a yellow sweater that smelled of milk and glue. He kept promises to himself that were small like a coin found in a coat and big like a vow to be. Work was dignity. Routine was safety. Friends like Mr. Patel and Rosa were not just neighbors, but lifelines. Daniel hid the year he lost his job from most people, and he hid the nights he cried alone in his car under a bridge from almost everyone. He was not a hero. He was a man who had been fixed by ordinary failures and by the tiny victories of paid rent and a clean school uniform. When Isabella came, he felt both the fear of not having enough and the strange, unexpected feeling that perhaps he had something to share that was not money. The laundromat smelled of soap and metal and was lit by a fluorescent light that had a buzz like a distant argument. Daniel pushed a cart past rows of machines where Lena hung a sign for folding service, and Omar balanced receipts with the care of a man counting prayers. Isabella took up a job wiping tables at the cafe next door and learned the timers and temper of coffee machines. Mr. Patel greeted Daniel each shift as if the business was a beloved old radio that he tended personally. "Good morning, Daniel," he said, and Daniel felt an honest pride swell. The work was physical and honest, and it made sense in a way that paperwork never did. There was a regular who always complained about the change in soap brand, and a woman who brought her knitting, and a boy who wanted to talk about soccer. Daniel taught Isabella the rhythm of the machines, how to count coins correctly, and how to smooth shirts in a way that made Chris Preston, the dry cleaner, pay a compliment. She was careful and quick, and she learned how to ask for a raise in a voice that sounded like a practiced bravery. Conversations at work were full and real, a cadence of requests and small triumphs. Mr. Patel hired Maya to help in small ways, sweeping crumbs and folding tiny towels, and she treated each task with importance. In one evening, Daniel mended a broken control knob and felt more competent than he had in months. And Isabella brewed a pot of coffee for the staff that literally made someone cry. She was that good with heat and timing. Names stuck, and each person offered a hand in ways that mattered more than money, because they offered respect and work. One afternoon, a small victory arrived, like an envelope slid under a door. A neighbor had found an extra 20 and had left it with a note about community funds. They pooled resources for a school trip and bought Maya a raincoat with reflective stripes so she would be safe. Isabella saved small tips and surprised Daniel with a repaired phone charger. There was a night when Carla from the bakery brought over cinnamon rolls because business had been slow, and she said, "You need to eat something, Daniel," and everyone laughed. That evening, Isabella sat Maya on her lap and handed her a crumpled paper crown and said, "I think you are the queen of this house." And Maya declared them both servants and gave them tasks that made everyone comply. The quiet moments of gratitude added together made a sense of belonging that had been absent for years. But victory is rarely a straight path. In the middle of this comfort, an item turned up heavy with other people's names. While doing laundry for a donation shift, Daniel found a silk scarf with an embroidered crest sewn into its lining and a small card tucked inside a pocket with a private number. Isabella looked startled as the crest belonged to a family that had been in headlines for wealth and privacy. The scarf smelled faintly of perfume and of places where rooms are named after donors. She froze and said, "I cannot explain this," and Daniel asked her to tell him the truth. The card was a secret, like a stone in a shoe that had to be addressed. This was the first pebble that would roll downhill and find ambitious feet. The discovery made an invisible pressure thicken in the air. A reporter named James appeared weeks later with questions that smelled like ink and ambition. He asked polite questions at first, but then began to circle, and Daniel felt that same old fear of being exposed to a world with louder rules. A man with a camera crouched under the bakery window, and a woman left a printed article at the laundromat suggesting a story about charity and influence. There came a call one afternoon from a woman who identified herself as Claudia Whitaker and asked for Isabella by name and said her father wanted to speak. The voice on the phone carried a polite certainty that things could be arranged. Daniel sat at his kitchen table with his hands clenched and listened as Isabella said, "Please no," and then, "Please do not tell me what to do." It was a scene of negotiation with polite pressure at its center. The choice became public and private at once when a representative arrived at the apartment not to ask but to demand that Isabella leave with promises of normal things like travel and protection. The offer smelled like a cage wrapped in silk. Daniel had to decide whether to hide someone who might be sought by men with titles and lawyers or to do what he had always learned to do and step into danger with his chest forward. The conversation involved bargaining, and bargaining always asks for a price. Isabella looked at Maya with a softness that was not weakness, and Daniel thought about calling a lawyer, and also about lending a blanket. The moral test existed in slow motions and in the quickness of a decision. There were two major confrontations that made the pressure concrete. The first came when a man named Robert Whitaker arrived with a driver and a car. He came into the laundromat to ask politely about a young woman who had been wearing a scarf that matched a catalog photograph. The exchange was cold and clinical, and the staff watched. Daniel answered with a voice that tried to be calm but felt like a boat tethered in storm water. Robert demanded to be put in touch, and when Daniel refused, he wrote down numbers and left a business card that smelled faintly of cigars and money. The second confrontation was public and ugly. A local station aired a segment about a missing heiress and showed a blurred image of a young woman who matched Isabella. A camera crew arrived at the block, and Officer Thompson asked for statements. The neighbors clustered because humans howled for company in difficult weather. The camera lights felt like tiny suns that burn truth away until only shapes remain. Isabella vanished for a day, and the apartment felt hollow, and then she returned, with her eyes wet and her hands empty. The first moment of tension lasted like an overlong note in music, 5 minutes that stretched and made each second echo. It forced Daniel to account for what matters, whether safety could be bought by someone else, and whether dignity could be negotiated away. He held the line against offers that sounded like rescue but smelled like control, and he found allies in Rosa and Lena who stood in the doorway and declared that a person is not a commodity. A deeper crisis followed. Isabella received a letter that threatened legal action and suggested custody claims and contractual obligations that might take her away from any small kind of freedom. The threat was not only to her, but to the fragile household. Rumors began to affect Daniel's work. Customers whispered about scandal, and one man refused to pay because he thought honesty meant he could avoid doing business with people connected to trouble. On a rainless evening, Maya fell ill with a fever that rose too fast, and they rushed to the emergency clinic. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and tired hope. Nurse Emily took Maya's temperature and held Daniel's hand in a brief human gesture that communicated more than pamphlets. While the machines quietly recorded a small victory, Isabella stayed in the waiting room, and at one point a lawyer named Thomas called, offering to take Isabella to a safe house and to help her avoid a public spectacle. Isabella looked at her daughter like a mirror of possible futures, and then she did something neither the lawyers nor the reporters expected. She walked out into the hospital corridor and found Daniel and said in a voice that had the directness of someone who had thought too long about price, "I do not want a life that is bought. I want a life that is chosen." The moment of decision was long enough to be its own kind of pressure and brief. Enough to keep from turning into a speech. It was the kind of scene where the right answer is not obvious, but it matters which way you move. The tension there was physical and moral, and it cost them sleep for many nights. That night, they agreed to face whatever came together and to refuse arrangements that erased the true person in exchange for comfort. There was a public confrontation that forced resolution. Robert Whittaker brought a lawyer and a polite but immovable request that Isabella return to her family estate for reasons of safety. The neighborhood gathered, some out of fear, some out of curiosity, and not a few out of duty to a child in a doorway. The negotiation took place in a small community meeting, and Clara from the bakery stood up and said, "We are a neighborhood, and you cannot take someone out of that without hearing the people who keep them." Mr. Patel, Rosa, Lena, Officer Thompson, and even Pastor Lewis came and gave brief statements about character and about how work teaches dignity and how that dignity should not be overridden by money alone. The lawyer offered hush money and services for school and private security, and it looked like a trap sewn with gold thread. Isabella surprised everyone by handing the lawyer a written statement she had prepared. In it, she said that she had chosen to be here, that she had found a family and a work that taught her things that no home with silver forks had given her. She declined the offers. It was a moral test laid in public. The audience felt the hum of a decision being made. There were tears and some boos, and then the slow noise of people taking sides. When Robert left without the victory he expected, someone in his entourage made a thin threat about publicity, and then the street resumed being a street with new marks in it. The scene lasted like a recorded confession, and it changed the tenor of how the town spoke about belonging. Crisis then forced an action that was small and heroically human. When Maya's fever spiked in the emergency room and monitors sang a threatening song, Isabella sat and held a small hand and sang nursery songs she had never known by heart. Daniel ran to find medication and to talk down a frightened receptionist, and the community came in waves. Mr. Patel called in to say he would cover the next payroll if they needed help. Carla baked bread and brought it to the clinic. Rosa stood in the doorway and said comforting words to Isabella that had nothing to do with money. In the hospital corridor, Daniel made a short speech to anyone who would listen about what a roof means and how a bed is not only an object but a place where dignity is restored. He told the doctor to do everything and then went back to stand by Maya like a monument of hope. This was not a heroic movie scene with music swelling like an ocean. It was quiet work, and it lasted for hours. When Maya began to breathe clearer and color returned to her cheeks, the room exhaled. The public acknowledgement of mutual care had a cost. The Whittaker family called once more, and now the argument shifted. If Isabella stayed in the neighborhood, the Whittaker name might be used in legal ways. The cost for privacy might become inconvenient lawsuits. So they made a plan that would allow Isabella to maintain distance while not erasing the life she had chosen. The months that followed were an exercise in choosing community over convenience and dignity over spectacle. 1 month later, they were still learning the choreography of living together. Maya had a new raincoat and new boots, and their washing machine had a new belt that Mr. Patel found on his break. There was a small fundraiser at the bakery where Carla made a tray of small tarts, and the crowd donated enough for a month of pasta, and for the first time in many months, Daniel did not worry about bread. Isabella had settled into a schedule at the cafe and enrolled in a night class about graphic design taught by Lena's cousin, and she began to draw logos for local small businesses as barter. She and Daniel signed a simple document with the help of a community legal clinic that laid out expectations and boundaries for privacy and for responsibility. They could not buy a house, but they bought an agreement to be accountable. 3 months later, things felt sturdier. Maya's laughter filled the rooms, and she had friends in school who came over to play and who took turns bringing small treats. Daniel had saved up enough to fix a leaky step on the stoop, and Mr. Patel put up a welcome mat at the laundromat that read, "Welcome Neighbors," with an extra dot of paint donated by Pastor Luis. Isabella had begun to work with Carla to make a small weekend stand offering pastries and handmade cards, and the sign read, "Second Chances," in chalk. The town started to talk differently about them. The stranger who had slept under a lamp became a member of a community that had chosen her. 6 months later, the change had weight. The small stand was now a modest corner business that earned enough to pay a couple of bills. Daniel had been offered a contract to maintain machines at a nearby school, and he accepted because work had become the kind of thing that offered pride, not just enough coin to survive. Isabella had reconnected with a cousin who did not carry the family's need to control and who helped her set up a small trust for her independent use that respected her privacy. Maya had a proper birthday with 2 cakes and a batch of handmade cards from neighbors. The Whitaker name had receded from front-page speculation into a back-page item about reconciliation. The real work of life preserved itself in routines, in the stacking of dishes, and in the way hands reached for one another without asking for payment. In the end, the story closes with something simple and stubborn like a promise kept. Daniel found that giving space to someone else did not take away the dignity from his own life. Isabella discovered that wealth could be a prison as well as a tool, and that liberty is often paid for in choices that disappoint people with expectations. The community learned that dignity is built by work and by small gestures, and that a child's safety is worth more than a headline. 1 month later, they still argued about the right time to water the herbs on Rose's window box, but they also sat down to a dinner where everyone contributed. 3 months later, they had a weekend market known for sincerity, where people bought pastry and advice in equal measure. 6 months later, the corner sign that had been a joke now had painted letters that shone in the morning sun and read "Second Chances," and both Daniel and Isabella signed the small plaque with their full names. If this story touched you, consider sharing it with someone who believes that people are not merely cast members in other people's lives, but protagonists of their own. A simple act of shelter can ripple outward and make a town kinder. If you saw yourself in any of these faces, leave a note in the comments with the word "I helped," and tell us in 1 sentence what happened. Your stories remind others that kindness is not expensive. It is a decision, and together we can show that dignity is the product of steady work, honest choices, and the courage to open a door.